And we are live. Thank you for joining us at our Martin Center webinar devoted to privacy, public health, and technology. My name is Dimitar Lilkov. I'm a research officer at the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies, which is a think tank and political foundation of the European People's Party in Brussels. Special thanks to our audience for joining our live webinar, which will last 45 minutes. Feel free to engage and ask your questions in the comment section below in our live Facebook feed. You've got 45 minutes to do so. In the final part of the event, we will be addressing your questions. A word of special thanks to our speakers as well for their being with us. First of all, I'd like to introduce Eva Majdel. Eva is a member of the European Parliament from the European People's Party and also president of the European Movement International. In the European Parliament, Eva has a proven track record in topics related to digitalization, technology, and the European digital single market. Eva, thanks for joining us. Our second speaker is Bruno Massage. He's a senior research associate of the Wilfred Martin Center, also a former Europe Minister of Portugal. Bruno Massage is author of several recent books, among which The Dawn of Eurasia and his most recent book, History Has Begun. Thank you as well for joining us. Before giving the floor to our speakers, I would like to very briefly introduce the topic today, and then we'll start the debate. After the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, several countries in Asia have been praised by medical experts and journalists for their response to COVID-19. Technology and digital contact tracing played a very special role in countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, which managed to limit the spread of the virus early on in March and April, and even prevent full lockdowns in their countries. Especially Singapore became a global inspiration as it developed its Trace Together app for contact tracing, which uses Bluetooth technology to anonymously record social interactions between people. This anonymous information can afterwards be used by health authorities to track and trace people who might have been exposed to the virus. And this method as well may be an essential way to prevent mass lockdowns in the future. In the last couple of months, digital contact tracing became a huge buzzword in the European Union. Many national governments in Europe are racing ahead with their own national digital apps for contact tracing based again on this Bluetooth technology and are rolling out their own applications. Now, Silicon Valley also joined in, and digital companies like Apple and Google are also planning to integrate similar contact tracing technology in the operation system of phones used worldwide. Serious questions remain about the design and overall rationale of these digital tracing apps, as well as their privacy standards. Experts are also wondering whether these contact tracing apps will be picked up and will actually be used by the population in Europe. So today, I would like to talk with our guest experts about digital contact tracing, privacy, and see how technology can help us in the fight against COVID-19. And after this introduction, I'd like to give the floor to Eva Majdel for a short kickoff on the topic. Eva, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dimitar. Glad to join Bruno to discuss this topic. And thank you, Martin Center, for the invitation and for being so engaged, actually, in the past couple of weeks, while there have been numerous lockdowns across Europe in keeping us informed with the most pressing issues. Well, when it comes to contact tracing apps, it's been definitely a buzzword for the past month. There has been already so many discussions and researches and press releases. So it's going to be perhaps a little bit hard to say something very revolutionary today, but I think it would be worth having exchanges, and it would be also very interesting to engage in the Q&A and also hear from the participants. But I would like to make a couple of points. So first of all, a bit of a general remark. I think that throughout the past weeks and months, COVID-19 crisis has shown us that we lack something very basic. And these are protocols and rules to how to effectively basically be able to halt the spread of this airborne virus. And contact tracing is one of these things that we should have some sort of rules or protocols on how to deal with this. Well, the analog way is very much known, and we are aware what it is. It might take up to 3 or to 4 days to track down 20 to 40 people that an infected person has been in contact. It is a very slow procedure in the fast-paced world in economies we currently live. So to be able to faster track the virus, I believe, could use technology as well as contact tracing apps. They could come very helpful, in particular when in an outbreak, we need to detect at least 80% of the contacts within 24 hours. I mean, without technology, just imagine people basically a little bit hectically running around cities or trying to interview people to trace people back. So of course, technology could come very handy. And I am in a way someone that likes to see technology as an enabler. But of course, there are certain aspects and issues that we should not absolutely forget about or neglect when we speak about using technology in this kind of circumstances. And the first one, of course, is privacy. The second one, data protection and data use. And lastly, the voluntary-based system and its limitations. And those three are not just separate aspects, but they're all interconnected. So on the privacy concern, just a couple of points. When we talk about it, I actually few days ago was in a conversation and held a discussion with Ivan Krastev, the political analyst, who actually very often sits on some of the Marta Center events. And he argues that privacy advocates are navigating the discussion the same way as in previous crises. And I thought a little bit about it. And if you go back, we had always the ghost of state surveillance in the debate of PNR, of GDPR, of e-privacy, even in migration. So while we need to acknowledge that privacy and the threat of government surveillance is there, there's also a good chunk, and I would say majority of citizens, if we look at latest studies and opinion polls that have been conducted, who would actually wouldn't mind sacrificing a part and a piece of their privacy for a period of time for the greater good of halting the spread of the virus. And also, a lot of people have been complaining on the lockdown, which in itself is some sort of a limitation of our freedoms as well. So I think we need to deliver to both kinds of concerns. And this could be done via, on one hand, having a very good privacy-friendly solutions by very well-informed citizens. And so authorities also have a lot of work to do on that part. And B, also by making sure that all sorts of health authorities and institutions are compliant with the data protection rules. And there's ways to ensure citizens that that's the case. And there's ways to beef up your data protection rules as an institutions. So the important part is that none of these technological means or solutions could work if we do not gain the trust of citizens and that they do not believe and trust that their data is protected, regardless where the data is collected, a centralized way or in a decentralized way. And I think it is also worth mentioning that digital solutions could sometimes, and I think in this case, do even a better job when preserving privacy than analog solutions. We see now restaurants or hairdresser salons asking you to manually write not just your name or phone number, but in certain cases, it happened to me, you need to write down your ID number on a piece of paper. How do we make sure that this piece of paper is protected and under what sort of rules? So I think we need to a little bit move away from the mindset that everything digital is automatically invasive of privacy, because that is not always necessarily true. It's about finding the right balance and respect for privacy. On my second point of data protection and data use, we saw that in the beginning of the discussion, two big companies moved in suggesting a solution. And Dimitar, you've mentioned that in your opening remarks. And I think this is a very important step, because it was much easier to have two tech giants basically agreeing on the basics and interoperability, rather than having a very lengthy decision-making procedure and negotiation among countries. This, however, should not absolutely prevent us from basically scrutinizing those solutions that were provided by Apple and Google, and look, for example, whether the APIs are really designed the way we are told they are, for example. We also need to ensure that the APIs are only used for COVID-19 crisis purposes, and only by the suggested and proper government and by the health authorities. I think in this sort of responses, governments and institutions together with multinationals actually could end up bearing an equal amount of responsibility to society based on the purposes and the means they create for society to use. Because on one hand, governments have the responsibility for the policy decision and the repercussions of it, and companies have the responsibility for the product they are making and the way that product could shape society. So this dialogue is very essential and very important. And lastly, very briefly, on the limitations of voluntary input on positive results. I mean, one could look at on the penetration of the app, and also once there is a good amount of penetration of the app, the limitation of voluntary input. It depends from what sort of society you belong to, but one could, of course, explore in places where economies rely much on hand labor, and so their quarantine and self-isolations are not an option, and some people's member of the same family might not be necessarily willing to sign themselves in, because this would automatically mean quarantine for the whole family, which could, I again said, could be part of a very heavily hand labor economy, and they would need to contribute to. And one last brief final remark, I think, as a more general point, I think this crisis have absolutely shown us that we need the free flow of data to be able to mine and forecast trends or make sense of past events. And I truly hope that this would give a further impetus and a further boost of the so-called data strategy that was proposed as an initiative to come also as proper legislation by the end of the year or next year. So we can actually finally start acting on the data economy rather than just talking about it and putting it as the basis of the sort of technological development and the prosperous, sustainable economies we want to see in Europe. So that would be my initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. And very, very quick follow-up. You mentioned Europe's data strategy, the impetus for the future. But if right now European member states develop their own national apps, and I've seen a list of at least 12, 13, 14 member states who have their own national apps, is this going to work in terms of sharing data between borders? Where is the European aspect when we talk about these contractors? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a very valid question and a very important one. And it's been one of my key kind of, so to say, things I've been emphasizing over the past couple of weeks. As long as governments work on interoperable ways of creating those apps, then we can avoid the patchwork. So that would be absolutely key and important, to put it very, very shortly. But, you know, I think interoperability has to be the main goal for these apps, but it is not a current reality. while tuning in. For example, I got an email from stakeholders saying we've created a new type of app, a European solution, should be used by governments, is based on this and this principles. So there's a lot going on, and if you visit a different country, you don't necessarily want to download a different app. So this would be absolutely key. And I think there's a number of suggestions also in the toolbox that the Commission presented, that this sort of patchwork has to be, could be avoided and has to be avoided.
Thanks. I would like to turn to Bruno Massage. Bruno, give us your take, and are you as optimistic about contact tracing, or maybe the conversation is about something completely else?
Well, I think contact tracing and using digital technology for contact tracing is absolutely essential. I've already made some important points about that. The virus and future pandemics move very quickly. I just tweeted a couple of days ago a link to a paper that tries to analyze the emergence of 2 outbreaks in Germany and Italy and the different stories that happened in Munich and then in Lombardy. German authorities were able to move very quickly at the end of January, in part because it was in the news, in part because it was a company so closely connected to Wuhan in China. So the alarm bells went off, and the outbreak was actually stopped in Munich. It wasn't stopped in Lombardy, but you have to stop it at the very beginning, in the first few hours, to identify, to trace all the contacts. You cannot do this. Munich was a happy story, but it's not going to happen many times. You cannot do this without using technology. And I've already made the point that actually, in some respects, the apps can preserve privacy better than manual solutions. The sheets of paper that you have to fill out, or it's happening today in the UK. The UK has delayed launching the app for still a few days or even weeks. And so the solution now that's being implemented today is actually people will identify their contacts to a call center, and then the call center will call someone and say, well, I'm sorry, but you happen to be the contact of an infected person, and you're now going to be in isolation. I mean, does this sound like a good solution? Because essentially you can make up a name. You can tell the call center that Dominic Cummings has been in contact with you, so he's going to have to be in isolation for 2 weeks. Manual solutions traditionally have a problem preserving privacy as well. And I hope we in Europe realize this, that there's a balance, there's a trade-off, but not necessarily on the side of manual solutions. I think Germany is doing pretty well with manual contact tracing, but Germany is special in this respect. It has the resources and the traditions to actually do this in a massive organized way. But even Germany, of course, was successful in the Munich case, but then a couple of weeks later, when it was really a massive inflow of people coming from ski hotels, then he wasn't able to do it. So I think we have to rely on technology. Now, the app itself, I think we also have to be realistic about what an app can do. It is very helpful, but it's not the whole process. And it has to be complemented with a human element. I think they have to go together. The app is not particularly smart or intelligent in the end. So the app is not able to tell you whether 2 people that are wearing contact, whether they were wearing masks or not. The Bluetooth signal is not going to tell you that. It's not even going to tell you whether there was a glass separation between the 2 people, or even a wall separation, which is, of course, critical. I also think we should be aware that the app is going to be subject to political decision-making. We're going to see that in the UK in the next couple of weeks. What parameters do you feed into the app? It's very subject here to political decision-making in terms of how quickly you want the country to open up. If you're going to say only the contacts that were in your vicinity for 1 hour are going to be identified by the app, then very few people are going to be identified. If you say 5 minutes or 3 minutes, then more people will be. And very subject to political arbitrariness, in the sense that if you want the country to open up and you're concerned about the economic situation, you're going to fit a 1 hour parameter so that very few people are identified and you can move on. So let's not have the illusion that we can do without technology, and let's not have the illusion that technology is enough. It's going to have to be a combination of it. factor and a technological element. I hope in Europe this is going to be an opportunity to have a sort of renewal in our enthusiasm for technology. Eva is a good spokesperson for that. Has been for many years, but I've been concerned for many years as well the way we've become very suspicious and sort of reactive way in Europe about technology, and I think we realize now that we need technology. Final point, we are quite comfortable with using technology and even what would deserve to be called digital surveillance in the case of global warming. We know about global warming and we can monitor it and trace it in real time because we've built a system of digital surveillance that encompasses every human activity and every economic activity and uses sophisticated computer models to predict where global warming is going. So I think, if you think about it in these terms, we realize the important thing is the safeguards that are in place and the goal that the system is being used for. And also, let's not be naive. What are the monetary economic incentives? What is the value of the data that is being produced? And who is appropriating this value? These are all very important questions, not immediately linked to privacy, but also very important in terms of data protection and data economics. I'll stop here, Dimitar.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to follow up on this, on the question of surveillance and prevention of specific problems. In some of your written pieces, you've argued that we need an upgrade surveillance system which is equipped to tackle pandemics. Using big data or predictive algorithms, you've also made the case that maybe we should make a parallel with counterterrorism prevention measures. Now, is such a pandemic prevention surveillance system technically and especially politically possible in Europe in the next couple of months?
I mean, we'll have to make choices. I think, one question that I guess you need a different panel to discuss this is, what is the future outlook for pandemics? Are we going to have more of these? And are we going to have pandemics that are potentially more serious than COVID? And are we perhaps going to have actually different pandemics developing almost simultaneously or in parallel? Is this the future we're heading towards? Everything I've read, every discussion I've had seems to support this view. If this is the case, then we have to get ready. And we have to create a system which is not about contact tracing. It's about prevention in the sense of actually identifying the outbreak at the very beginning, not tracing contacts after it's present and identifying a potential new pathogen, a potential new virus. And this, I think, can be done through technology that we have. There's some interesting ideas being thrown around of analyzing sewage water can tell you where outbreak is going to happen a week before it actually happens. Monitoring people's temperature. This could be done in a strictly voluntary way. More and more people are buying internet-connected thermometers. And so this is going to be fed into usually it's going to be a private company, but it shouldn't be. The authorities, in my opinion, should also have access to this. And then you can detect very quickly and very effectively and with precision where an outbreak is happening. And if you use AI to actually process all this information, which in many cases, all this data in many cases is already available, then we'd have a robust system. I'm a bit afraid of if we go into this future world that I described at the beginning, completely unprepared, then we have to be ready for always being subject to being disrupted, both our economies and our lives. Because I think in the future, even the rumor that a new pandemic may be starting probably is going to be enough to shave off a few points of GDP here and there. That this is now the new world we've entered. Even if it's not as serious as this, just the fear and the anxiety that this is going to create in the future, we have to create a system that allows us to return to the world before 6 months ago.
Bruno is raising a very interesting point on the role of private companies in the handling of this, and I would like to take this and throw a question to Eva. Bruno also mentioned monetization of data and potential exploitation and the role of national governments and private companies. Now, Eva, when we talk about Apple and Google in their contact tracing endeavors, do you think that maybe we're allowing a private company to sit around a decision-making table? And aren't we making them a key stakeholder in an issue where national health authorities should be in the driving seat? Aren't we empowering digital companies too much?
Well, I think I said that I think right now it's very important to find ways to work together with companies that could provide solutions together with governments. And a company providing a solution does not necessarily mean the company owns any of this data. Actually, when it comes to the solution that's provided by Apple and Google, it just provides a platform where governments could develop their own particular apps. And I think what is absolutely key is that this data is not monetized. If you think about data that we currently produce, to use that word on our devices, most of the time it is actually monetized. And most of the time, consumers don't even understand that their data is monetized. And it's monetized for all sorts of, unnecessary things sometimes, for pushing you an app of sports equipment, for example, when right now you much rather prefer to use your data to be used so that you, your family, your close, like society as a whole could be safe and could be healthy and to help spread the virus further. I think right now iOS and Android are, and sorry, let me build on, that was first the point, not to be monetized. The second point is there's various ways of the way you could do it. So it could be just the health authority having that data. It could be data that is relinquished and deleted entirely after 14 days, and only on a basis of 14 days that it is basically renewed. The moment you don't use the app for one or another reason, this data should also be totally deleted, and so on and so forth. It also has to be clear that this data is just and entirely solely for this and that purpose used by the health authorities. And this is why earlier I said governments have a huge responsibility explaining that, because we could see that there is a very low penetration of apps. Well, the penetration of using this sort of apps will not grow higher if citizens are not aware exactly what that app does. And so maybe there are governments already being very informative, doing a very good job of saying why this app would be important. But if you don't tell the whole story, why this is part, as also Bruno was saying, of the whole solution that could help us spread, that could help us stop spread the virus, it would be very difficult to have a penetration and a use of the app. So I think what is better is to have a solution that's provided in this particular case by tech giants, because it can be interoperable and it can give the health authorities, exactly as I said, to basically produce and to make the opportunity, create their interoperable apps themselves. And this is the situation that we currently have. I have to remind that using a Bluetooth-based solution was part of the EU toolbox for on apps, and is part of the recommendation. And I think it is a positive thing, this sort of development, and it's a positive thing that these companies also abide by the EU toolbox, by the suggestions provided. And because also we need to consider that Bluetooth is not generally a solution that has been existing there because it's designed for contact tracing. It's for other purposes that has been using. But we see an available moment right now to be used for something that could be helpful in a different respect. What we could do to avoid the dominance of these companies is to look into what kind of technology we need for an effective, basically, contact tracing, and invest on it in a European scale. So as Bruno mentioned, and maybe this could build, a little bit more on his point in a way, is we need to be prepared for what comes next. And we need to feel comfortable using solutions that we have not used before, because they could help us spread a similar situation in the future much faster. So this is why it's an important moment not to just brush off and say, well, there are those solutions, but we don't need them anymore, or we don't feel comfortable, or there's not enough privacy. I think it's a very good moment to explain, to show what could be done, so that we are going to be more prepared and ready if similar situations occur, to act on them much faster and have the tools already there.
Great. I think this is a great segue to maybe elevate the conversation a bit and not only get stuck in contact tracing, privacy, or apps, and talk about technology in general. So maybe a question to both of you, starting with Bruno. What specific additional technologies, you've referenced some ideas for the future, but what other technologies can we explore in the fight against COVID or future pandemics? This is number one. And number two, there's an interesting critique coming from both sides of the political spectrum that the technology and the solutions we see in the last decade or so are mostly used for entertainment, mostly used for convenience. Breakthroughs we've been seeing lately, I mean, a bigger phone or Instagram is nothing, doesn't really make your life that better in the physical world. So Bruno, question to you.
No, absolutely. I think that's the way to think about this. I was hopeful and still am that the pandemic could actually be a moment where we rethink our approach to the internet in general, almost our philosophical approach to the internet. So far, the internet has been very focused on entertainment, consumer experience, social media. But of course, we've known for many years, not to say more than 10 years, that the internet's impact could be much greater when applied to industry, Internet of Things, to city life, and so on and so forth. And there are reasons this has been delayed, and concerns about privacy are one of them. But I think we've also been lacking the incentive and a moment to push us forward in this direction. This is important for Europe, by the way. I'm sure Eva is thinking about this because there's a line that I hear a lot in Brussels that Europe lost the race for the entertainment internet and the social media internet, but it could still win the second race, potentially more important for, let us call it the industrial internet of the future. And the pandemic is a good example of this. If we had an internet that was less focused on sharing pictures and sharing moments from our lives and more focused on having a grip on our physical environment, perhaps we wouldn't be going through what we're going now. What I talked about having a certain element of digital surveillance. If you want to find another word instead of surveillance, I try not to get fixated on words, but of course, this is a word that creates problem. But a system of digital intelligence, information, of knowledge has to be deepened and developed. And then the second half, it's interesting because the more you think about COVID and its impact, the more you realize that actually every area of technology that I've been thinking about for the past 5 years is relevant. And another area that is very relevant is supercomputers, AI, and simulations in order to develop vaccines. There's no reason in principle that you actually have to test a vaccine on human beings and rely on the biological clock, biological processes that are very slow. You could develop potentially, this is what experts tell me, you could potentially develop a vaccine in 2 or 3 weeks by using supercomputers that don't exist yet and running trillions of simulations every day of how a particular vaccine works on the biological system that's being simulated in these supercomputers. So I think that's another area that's being developed. Already, I think, if it turns out, as we all hope, that the vaccine is going to be available still in 2020, it's because of the developments in AI and computers. It's not because the knowledge we have is different, it's because of the technology we have is different. And this can be even more accelerated so that in the future, actually, we may be approaching a post-pandemic world where we don't have to worry about these things anymore because we're able to develop a vaccine so quickly that it actually arrives before much damage has been done. I think these are the areas that are interesting, and it causes us to actually rethink the way we think about technology and the internet in particular.
Eva, technology is
yes.
an enabler. How can we elevate technology?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, again, I'm glad that we are putting it in a little bit broader terms. And I mean, I have, in a way, also a suggestion, because I think, as Bruno mentioned, we've been so focused on trying to have a European Amazon on a European Google. And I've always said that this has not been the right approach, because this is a limiting approach. You want to copy something or are uncomfortable with something that exists that makes our lives better, yes, in a consumer way or in an entertaining way, but people and citizens find it good by trying to do something the same. And I think it has been the wrong approach. And now, if we kind of miss this moment right now, even if COVID was not there, it was still the right moment. But now I hope it's more of an eye-opener. Having in mind, we have the discussion on the recovery plan, we have the discussions on the MFF right now. We absolutely have to invest in this industrial strength that we have and move them to the next level. I think Bruno called it second wave of internet. We could use that terminology or another type of terminology, but Europe has to understand that we are so strong in our industries. It's time to, advance them in technological terms. We have to bridge this gap that there is. And I think sometimes companies are way more advanced than we actually perceive, or we as EPP perceive at least. And we sometimes try not to overburden them, rather than we need to think how to better enable them and how to give them the opportunities to get to that next level. And in this respect, because of what was revealed yesterday, I have a little bit of difficulties to understand the mindset when it comes to first putting the targets in terms of green topics, and only then speaking about the technologies. So we could never reach those ambitious targets if we don't have the means of how to achieve those targets. And in this respect, I could kind of feel and sense that investment in technologies is still not as prioritized as I personally would like to see in Europe. Investment in technology has been written into speeches 10 and 15 years ago from leaders, but where are we actually on the ground in investing in some of those key technologies for Europe that could enable us, be the ones to pioneer the next vaccine, be the ones to pioneer the next groundbreaking achievement. And so in this respect, and here we have to say it is absolutely crucial to collaborate with the private sector. Today, it is not the government that comes with the solution. It is most of the time the private sector. And if we enable the private sector to innovate and to grow, it is a good thing. We have done our job, and we have done our job correctly. So I would like to see a little bit more in this way. And I would like to see, also think tanks such as Martin Center. Let's try to bring this super important debate absolutely at the heart to European leaders. Now we're just discussing chunks of money. The most important thing is what is behind these chunks of money? What are the projects we are investing? Do we have these shovel-ready projects that we could invest? Are they novel enough? Are they innovative enough? Would they really make our economies more competitive? Our generation, I think, and the generations that come next, they're the ones that do not want more of the same, what we used to have for the past 10, 5, 15, 20 years. They want things that would make their lives easier, would make it easier for them to repay the debt that we are going to overburden them with the decisions that we are about to take at the European level. And that could only be possible if these economies and these companies at a European countries are enough prepared, I think.
I'm checking the latest comments, and I would like to involve the audience as well. We've got two questions which I can bundle in one, and they're both related with contact tracing apps. How can we ensure that at least 80% of the population in Europe uses these apps? How can we make sure that people engage and actually are using them? And the second question comes from Marty Heiko. The second one is, why in Europe are there no new global players in emerging telecom industries? Second question is quite specific. So number one, how can we make people use these apps? And number two, why are there no new European global players in telecoms? Bruno?
Yes. So the first question, how can we make sure that a high percentage of people use it? I'm afraid that this is going to be very difficult, particularly in Europe. And even in Singapore, last time I checked, the app was being used by about 40% of people. And this is a country where everyone is daily focused on the common good. Everyone is very diligently trying to promote public health goods. Privacy is not on top of everyone's minds as it is in Europe. So I'm concerned that that's not going to happen. I mean, in discussions I've had about this, people ask me about possible suggestions. I mean, there could be potentially an incentive that we could offer people. I don't think we want to go down the road of actually making it mandatory. I think India has made it mandatory. This is not going to work in Europe. So we need an incentive. And this could be, I mean, the sort of hard approach here would be to make the app mandatory if you're going to use certain kinds of facilities. If you're going to go into a mall, you need to show that you have an app on your phone. I think this is perhaps also unacceptable in Europe. You could offer a monetary incentive, some gigabytes of free data or other kinds of incentives. Because it's important to have a high number of people using the app. And I think one of the reasons it's been delayed in many countries, and I think the enthusiasm is not as high as people thought a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, is precisely that we realized that it's going to be difficult to have a critical mass of people joining. And then, I made some calculations in a piece I wrote. If 20% of people join, if only half the people who join have the Bluetooth on, and then if only half the people that are actually test positive communicate that to the app, then we end up identifying about 2% of potential contacts, which is essentially negligible. So again, go back to the point that we shouldn't rely on the app as a silver bullet, and then perhaps think about ways to incentivize people to use the app. Then how can we make sure that Europe has global players? I mean, Eva talked about this. It's been ongoing, this discussion in Europe for a long time. We need to rethink our capital markets. I mean, even if you have many valid criticisms about Silicon Valley, one thing that seems to work well is the venture capital system that is in place. Europe is much more reliant on bank credit, and bank credit is not suited, in my opinion, to finance and invest in the technology of the future. It's much more conservative and cautious about those things. So this is an ongoing discussion and not enough progress. We could use the recovery plan. Eva makes a very good point. I remember the Juncker plan that I'm a fan of. I was in government back then, so I followed it very closely. I do think, I'm going to put words in Eva's mouth, but I do think back in the Juncker plan, there was a certain balance between the political economy, we have solidarity, and actually the goal of the plan, the economic goal of the plan. What do we want to finance and what is the result that we want? This time around, for reasons that are understandable, but that can perhaps still be corrected to some extent, the focus has been almost entirely on the political economy, that we have to show solidarity towards the South, and no one has contributed much in terms of exactly what are the outcomes that we want to have. And one particular outcome is, well, let's make Europe a leading player in some of these new technologies, particularly the Internet of Things and other kinds of a new wave of Internet and digital technology, where essentially what is at stake is a merging, a fusion between the physical and the digital world. I think that's what distinguishes this second wave. And Europe could really be, as Eva put it, because of our industrial strength, could really be a major player, and we could use this recovery plan to actually create the Amazons and the Googles and the Apples of the future, which are going to be potentially actually more important than even Apple and Google were. Amazon, by the way, I think is a bit different because Amazon has actually actively been moving towards this second wave already, creating digital physical stores, for example, is an example of this merger that I'm talking about.
Great. Eva, follow up on the two questions on adoption of the apps and big players in telecoms from Europe.
Yeah, sure. So briefly, again, on how to ensure at least an 80% penetration, which is the ideal amount of penetration in order to have a high percentage of actually people that you track down, but is also an almost impossible percentage to reach currently. So if you ask me in theory whether it's possible, I think it is possible, but in practice, in Europe right now, it's very, very difficult. I think it could work in some countries, maybe medium-sized countries, if there is a very concrete, very targeted information, if there's a very high awareness of what those apps are, what their purpose is. Basically, the part of the government and institutions have to be beefed up in the information campaign. This would also only work if citizens trust their governments, their parliaments, their institutions as a whole, and if they have a high trust in them, if they also believe that those institutions protect the data, and if they obey by certain data protection rules and regulations. So those sorts of information campaigns the government could try to do, could try to engage with influencers from across the fields to promote the usage of these sorts of instruments. But again, just like Bruno was saying, it's a very difficult exercise. But again, we don't need to diminish it. I think it will be important to build on it and to use it as a momentum to continuously work on it. So it should not be something that we don't talk anymore about. It should not be something that we just park in a garage and we leave it when the next certain similar occasion occurs. It should be something that we continue to develop and find ways of how to improve it in the long run, also in terms of citizens' trust and citizens' penetration and usage. On the second point on telcos, I have a very particular opinion when it comes to the traditional telcos, and that is that I think some years ago they should have or, you know, one could say they should have invested, government should have provided them with investments, the European Union grants or funding should have went to them, however you want to put it. You know, they should have invested in some of the technologies that were developed by countries outside of the EU. We are using a platform now that is not necessarily designed in the EU as far as I'm concerned, and many other platforms. Some of the text messaging and so on channels that we use or phone channels we use were not connected in Europe. When I've spoken, if I remember correctly, with some of those more traditional telcos, they were like, well, back then we were building on the 2G or on the 3G, so we invested all our money into that. We had no money to invest elsewhere. So I think they were, in a way, clinging too much on let's get as much as possible from roaming, and we don't need to innovate because we anyhow get revenue, and they missed the innovative part. And this is a very good example how we should not miss the innovation part when it comes to automobiles or other industries that we are strong in Europe. In the same time, when we speak about 5G, for example, we have European companies such as Ericsson or Nokia that are doing a very good job. So this could be potentially enabling 5G connectivity and then helping them to be this next generation businesses. Perhaps the question could refer to this sort of point. But here, just to pick on also what Bruno said, because the Juncker plan is a favorite of mine, I have to say, because it was a political decision. It was a bold political decision. It delivered in less than 6 months after the idea to become an actual working plan. And it has results because it had an aim. What does it want to achieve? And this is where I very often struggle with some of our European programs. And as I said, we fight more how much money we should allocate, whether 10 million more or 10 billion more, but we don't speak where do we want to invest them. We don't actually have the debate. So each member state or each university uses this for a different research, for a different project, and there is just this patchwork of good ideas and projects that are spread around and that very often cannot scale enough in order to make a very big impact. So I think the Juncker plan is a good example that has to be used also throughout this crisis. It has to be beefed up and it has to have a real purpose, because indeed what we need now is more support for these good ideas.
Thank you very much, Eva. We're running over time, but I'm really tempted for one closing question for both of you. If you can please limit to 60 seconds. First question, we'll go into Bruno, picking up on Europe's role in the whole technological race. Bruno, what do you think about Europe's quest for technological sovereignty, especially given the rise of digital companies in China and in the US? Question to you. And Eva, there is a follow-up question from our chat. Again, on how can we make sure that data used by Silicon Valley companies for contact tracing is not monetized, and how can we make sure that it's deleted? And a specific question maybe to you as well. Can we move away from smartphone solutions to hardware tokens, to physical tokens for contact tracing? Please, 60 seconds, starting with Bruno, technological sovereignty.
Well, it's not a word that I like, or a term that I like. I know what's being referred to, but it shows how things have changed in Europe, because 5 years ago, technological sovereignty was the thing we're fighting against. And apparently now we're supposed to be fighting for it. No, I think we need more influence and power and a certain ability to project our economic power outside our borders. But I think technological sovereignty is a term that seems to point towards autarky, towards being isolated from others. I still want to believe that it's possibly to have a globally integrated world. Now, we do need to have a sharper concept of European economic power. And if that's what we mean by sovereignty, then I can go along with it. But let's try to keep borders open to the flow of ideas and the flow of technology.
Thanks very much. Eva, final 60 seconds, closing words.
Yeah, that's going to be a very, very brief. So on not monetizing data, how can we make sure? I think the most important thing is, so first of all, as I said, this data should be stored by the health authorities and not by the companies. And I think the API solution provided by the two tech giants exactly aims at that. And when you talk about, multinationals and companies, I mean, they have to sell you a product. And I don't say the API is necessarily a product, but many citizens do use those sorts of products. And the most important thing is trust. And if at some point, even one consumer understands that this trust is breached, the whole company's reputation is at risk. So I think companies that operate in the field of technologies do not take these things lightly at all. So therefore, I personally believe there's a lot of work being done to make sure that data in certain products is protected, and the way it's said, it is indeed protected. Otherwise, citizens won't trust to use it. But again, I think data not to be monetized, it has to be not monetized by the health authorities, because they're the ones who are supposed to have the data. Physical tokens or QR codes, I think these are all solutions that could be explored. Again, depending on the way they're used. And one of the European solutions that I was referring earlier is exactly providing a physical token. So these are all options. And I think these are all options which enable us to continue this discussion and this debate. Because ultimately what we want is that citizens feel more, citizens feel more comfortable with using technologies to also protect those around us, societies themselves, and enable us to do our work, daily jobs, daily life, the way we used to know it. Because the most things that people wanted to do after the lockdowns were simple things that they used to do every day. And technology could enable that if it's, of course, used in the right way, with the right privacy enacted, and so on and so forth. But I would like us to continue discussion and indeed elevate it on the importance of basically making sure that we are better prepared when it comes to the new wave of technological revolution that is coming.
That's a fantastic way to close, and we're running 10 minutes over time. So I'd really warmly like to thank both Bruno and Eva for reminding us the importance of technology as an enabler, but also the importance of being realistic about when we talk about the possibilities of contact tracing apps. And hopefully maybe as a key takeaway from this conversation that Europe has to think how we should move away from entertainment and convenience when we talk about technology, and how we should reinvent the possibilities of the internet, and hopefully the recovery plan for Europe is going to be a key enabler in this direction. Thank you both.
Thank you, Dimitar. It's a pleasure.
Really warm thanks for our audience and online as well. So stay tuned to the Martin Center and our online content and research. Have a nice day.
Thank you.